I still remember the day everyone laughed at Emily, and she smiled as if their cruel words had no power over her. They called her too poor, too plain, and too heavy to ever be loved by a man with money or respect. They laughed because her dress was old, her shoes were worn, and her hands carried the marks of years spent cleaning other people's homes. No one asked how much pain she hid behind those gentle eyes. No one cared that every insult stayed with her long after the voices disappeared. Emily had learned a long time ago that some battles could not be won with anger. Sometimes the only thing left was silence. Every morning she woke before sunrise, worked until her feet ached, and returned to the tiny apartment she shared with her sick grandmother. The rent was always late. The medicine was always too expensive. Yet every evening she still sat beside her grandmother's bed, smiled softly, and promised that tomorrow would somehow be better. She never believed those words completely, but she said them anyway because hope was the only gift she could still afford. Across the city, people whispered a very different name with fear instead of pity. Adrian Moretti was a man whose business empire stretched across countries, but behind the polished offices and expensive suits was a criminal world that very few people dared to mention. Powerful politicians shook his hand in public. Dangerous men obeyed him without asking questions. His enemies disappeared so quickly that newspapers stopped trying to explain what had happened. He was known as the Mafia boss who trusted no one, loved no one, and never forgave betrayal. His cold eyes could silence an entire room. Even his closest bodyguards avoided looking directly at him for too long. Adrian believed emotions were dangerous. Love made people weak. Kindness invited betrayal. He had built his empire by keeping his heart locked away. But even a man like Adrian had a problem that money could not solve. A powerful international business deal required him to appear as a devoted family man. The investors wanted stability, respectability, and a public image that looked perfect. Rumors about his dangerous private life were beginning to damage important negotiations. His advisors begged him to marry. He refused every suggestion. Then one of his lawyers offered a simple solution. Hire a woman to act as his wife for 6 months. A legal contract. No romance. No personal questions. Just appearances. Adrian agreed immediately because feelings would never become part of the arrangement. A team was sent to search for someone ordinary, someone with no connections to powerful families, someone who would accept the money without asking difficult questions. Many women applied after hearing about the enormous payment, but Adrian rejected every single one. Some were too ambitious. Some talked too much. Some were clearly hoping to become his real wife. He walked away from every interview with the same expression of disappointment. Then fate quietly changed everything. Emily was not searching for a husband. She was searching for another cleaning job after losing one of her regular clients. She entered a large office building believing she was applying to clean luxury apartments. Instead, she accidentally walked into the waiting room where the interviews were taking place. Before she realized the mistake, Adrian entered the room. Everyone immediately stood up except Emily, who was too busy gathering the papers she had dropped onto the floor. One of Adrian's assistants shouted at her for being disrespectful. Emily quickly apologized and tried to explain she was in the wrong place. Adrian looked at her for several long seconds. She expected him to laugh like everyone else usually did. Instead, he simply asked, "Why? Aren't you afraid of me?" Emily blinked with confusion. "Because I don't know who you are," she answered honestly. The room became completely silent. No one had ever spoken to Adrian like that. His assistant looked ready to faint. Adrian studied her face again. There was no greed in her eyes. No excitement. No fear. Just simple honesty. For reasons he could not explain, he told everyone else to leave. Emily stood alone with the most feared man in the city, wondering if she had just destroyed her chance of finding work. Adrian offered her the contract without any unnecessary conversation. She stared at the number written on the first page. It was more money than she could earn in many years. Her hands trembled. "There must be a mistake," she whispered. Adrian shook his head. "There isn't." She looked up carefully. "Why me?" Adrian answered with the same cold voice he used in every business meeting. "Because you don't seem interested in me." Emily almost laughed at the strange answer, but she stopped herself. She explained about her grandmother, the medical bills, and the apartment they were about to lose. Adrian listened without showing any emotion. When she finished speaking, he simply placed a pen beside the contract. Read everything. If you agree, your problems disappear tomorrow. Emily spent nearly an hour reading every page. There would be separate bedrooms. Public appearances together. Absolute confidentiality. No physical relationship unless required for public appearances, and even then only with her consent. At the end of 6 months, she would receive enough money to start a completely new life. She thought about her grandmother coughing through the night. She thought about unpaid bills. She thought about all the doors that had closed because people judged her before hearing her speak. Finally, with tears quietly gathering in her eyes, she signed her name. Adrian took the contract without smiling. Your life changes today. Within 24 hours Emily was living inside a mansion so large she became lost trying to find the dining room. Expensive paintings covered the walls. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings. Luxury surrounded her everywhere, yet she had never felt more out of place. The servants stared at her with hidden amusement. Some whispered when they thought she could not hear them. They questioned why a woman like her had been chosen. One maid laughed quietly and said the boss must have lost a bet. Emily pretended not to notice. She unpacked her few simple clothes into a wardrobe larger than her old bedroom and reminded herself why she was there. This was never supposed to be about pride. It was about survival. Adrian remained distant. They shared breakfast only when photographers were waiting outside. During private moments he barely spoke. Every conversation was short, polite, and cold. Emily accepted the distance because the contract had promised exactly that. But slowly she began noticing things other people ignored. Adrian often skipped meals while working late into the night. He never celebrated birthdays. He never laughed with his employees. Sometimes she heard him walking alone through the mansion long after midnight, unable to sleep. Behind the powerful reputation stood a lonely man trapped inside walls he had built himself. Emily never mentioned it. Instead, she quietly left fresh coffee outside his office every morning without saying it was from her. She asked the kitchen staff to prepare healthier meals because she noticed he hardly touched rich food. When an elderly gardener injured his hand, Emily spent the afternoon helping him finish his work even though no one had asked her to. The staff watched with growing confusion. She treated everyone with the same kindness whether they respected her or not. Adrian noticed everything, even though he pretended not to. One rainy evening he returned from a difficult meeting to find Emily sitting on the mansion steps beside a frightened stray dog. The little animal was soaked, shaking from the cold, and hiding behind her legs. Adrian stopped walking. "Why is that dog here?" he asked. Emily gently wrapped the animal in her own sweater. "Because it has nowhere else to go," Adrian answered without emotion. Neither did thousands of other stray dogs. Emily looked at him quietly. "But this one crossed my path today." For the first time in many years, Adrian had no reply. He simply stood there, watching the woman everyone considered ordinary cradle a frightened animal as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Something deep inside him moved ever so slightly, though he refused to admit it, because men like Adrian Moretti believed that the smallest crack in the heart could one day bring down an empire. The next morning, Adrian told himself the strange feeling would disappear if he simply ignored it. Feelings had never helped him survive. They had only created weakness, and weakness had always been punished. He buried himself in meetings, contracts, and endless phone calls, yet his mind kept returning to the image of Emily protecting a frightened stray dog with her own sweater while standing in the rain. No one had ever expected kindness from the people around him. Everyone wanted something from Adrian Moretti. Money, power, protection, influence. Emily never asked for any of those things. She simply cared, even when nobody was watching. Days slowly turned into weeks. Their fake marriage became the favorite topic of every magazine in the city. Some people admired them. Others mocked Emily behind her back. Wealthy women whispered that Adrian had chosen her only because no beautiful woman would ever accept such a cold man. Men laughed that she looked completely out of place beside one of the richest men in the country. Emily heard every cruel comment. She smiled politely and kept walking. Adrian noticed the insults, but she never complained once. One evening they attended a charity gala filled with famous businessmen, politicians, and celebrities. Emily wore a simple cream-colored gown chosen by the stylist. Even in an expensive dress she looked nervous, as though she had accidentally entered a world where she did not belong. Adrian offered his arm. Cameras flashed from every direction. She placed her hand gently on his sleeve, remembering the contract. Inside the ballroom, people greeted Adrian with fake smiles. Then came Isabella, the elegant daughter of a billionaire who had wanted to marry Adrian for years. She looked Emily up and down before laughing quietly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I always imagined your wife would be unforgettable. I just didn't expect people to remember her because she looked like the cook. Several guests laughed with her. Emily lowered her eyes. She wanted to disappear. Before she could step away, Adrian spoke in a calm voice that silenced the room. The difference between my wife and some people here is simple. She has a beautiful heart. That cannot be bought. Isabella's smile disappeared instantly. No one laughed again. Emily looked at Adrian with surprise. He did not even glance at her. He simply guided her toward their table as if nothing unusual had happened. It was the first time anyone powerful had defended her instead of joining those who mocked her. That single moment stayed in her heart long after the evening ended. Adrian pretended it meant nothing, but his bodyguards exchanged quiet looks. Their boss had never defended anyone before. A few days later Emily visited her grandmother in a private medical center Adrian had secretly arranged after signing the contract. Her grandmother looked healthier than she had in years. Holding Emily's hands, the old woman smiled warmly. That man looks frightening, but he watches you when you aren't looking. Emily laughed softly. He's only protecting his reputation. Her grandmother gently shook her head. No, child. A person can pretend with words, but not with their eyes. Emily said nothing because she refused to believe something impossible. Meanwhile, trouble was quietly approaching. Adrian's biggest rival, Victor Salazar, had spent months searching for any weakness he could exploit. When he discovered Adrian had suddenly married an ordinary woman with no powerful family, he smiled. He believed Emily would be the easiest target in the world. One afternoon, while Adrian attended an important meeting overseas, Emily left the medical center after visiting her grandmother. A black vehicle stopped beside her. Before she understood what was happening, armed men forced her inside. Her phone fell onto the street. By the time Adrian landed several hours later, his security chief was waiting with terrible news. No one in the mansion dared to breathe as Adrian listened. The room became completely silent. His face showed no emotion, but everyone who worked for him understood something terrifying had just changed. Adrian slowly removed his watch and placed it on the table. Find her, he said quietly. That was all. Within minutes, the entire city moved. Men who had never failed him searched every warehouse, every abandoned building, every hidden road. Police officers secretly loyal to Adrian closed highways without asking questions. Helicopters filled the night sky. Victor believed Adrian would negotiate. Instead, he had awakened a storm. Emily remained frightened, but she refused to beg her captors for mercy. She remembered every lesson life had taught her. Fear could control the body, but it did not have to control the heart. Hours later Victor entered the room where she was being held. He smiled cruelly. Do you know why you're here? Emily remained silent. Because powerful men always have one weakness, he continued. And now I've found Adrian's. Emily answered softly, you're wrong. I'm only his fake wife. Victor laughed. Then why has he destroyed half the city looking for you? Emily had no answer. At sunrise Adrian finally discovered the warehouse. His men surrounded the building from every direction. Victor expected negotiations. Instead, Adrian walked through the front entrance alone. Every criminal inside lowered their weapons. They had never seen him look like this before. His voice remained calm, but his eyes were colder than anyone could remember. You touched someone under my protection, he said. That was your last mistake. Minutes later the warehouse was secured. Emily rushed toward Adrian, tears filling her eyes. Before she could stop herself, she hugged him tightly. Adrian stood completely still for a second. Then, without thinking about the contract or the cameras or his reputation, he wrapped his arms around her and held her as though losing her had been the most frightening experience of his life. Back at the mansion, doctors confirmed Emily was unharmed. Adrian stayed outside her room until morning. When she opened the door, she found him sitting quietly with untouched coffee beside him. You never went to sleep. she asked. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before speaking words he had never imagined saying to anyone. I thought I hired a fake wife. Emily smiled sadly. You did. He slowly shook his head. Somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling fake. Tears filled her eyes again. Adrian took one careful step closer. I spent my whole life believing love made people weak. Yesterday I learned something else. Living without love makes people empty. Emily reached for his hand. You don't have to be empty anymore. Several weeks later the 6-month contract officially ended. Adrian placed the documents on the fireplace and burned every page without reading them. Emily watched quietly. What are you doing? She whispered. Adrian smiled, a real smile that no one had seen before. Ending the only agreement I ever regretted writing. He knelt in front of her, holding a simple ring instead of an expensive one covered in diamonds. Emily, this time I'm not asking you to pretend. Will you stay because you choose me, not because you signed a contract? Emily could no longer hold back her tears. She nodded before he even finished speaking. Yes, she whispered. 1,000 times, yes. Months later the mansion no longer felt cold. Laughter echoed through the halls. The servants who once mocked Emily now respected her because she had never answered cruelty with cruelty. She helped the staff, supported charities, and opened a shelter for abandoned animals in memory of the little dog that had unknowingly changed everything. Adrian remained powerful, but people slowly noticed another difference. He still protected his empire with strength, yet he treated honest people with unexpected kindness. The man everyone feared had finally found peace, not through wealth or power, but through the quiet love of the woman the world had underestimated. The same people who once laughed at Emily now admired her, not because she became rich, but because she never allowed bitterness to change her gentle heart. Sometimes justice does not arrive with revenge. Sometimes it arrives when those who mocked your worth are forced to witness the beautiful life that patience, kindness, and quiet courage built without their permission.